It began as a whisper among cybersecurity analysts, rumors circulating in underground forums, Russian-language chat boards, and confidential threat intel mailing lists. No headlines, no police statements, no banks admitting losses. Just fragments of conversations, hinting that someone had found a way to make ATMs dispense cash without touching a single button. At first, most investigators ignored the claims. The idea sounded more like urban cyber folklore than a real criminal breakthrough. After all, ATM security had evolved over decades, and banks believed their machines were protected behind layers of encryption, alarms, and closed-circuit surveillance. But something about those early whispers felt different. They weren't bragging, they were cautious, shared only in vetted hacker circles, in closed groups where reputation mattered more than money. Behind these rumors was a quiet shift happening in Russia during the late 2000s. The country was rapidly modernizing its banking infrastructure. Thousands of new ATMs were deployed nationwide, many connected to banks through Windows-based systems. Financial institutions were excited, cash access was expanding, card services were growing, and contactless banking was becoming the future. But modernization came with an overlooked consequence. Rapid rollout meant rushed security, unpatched systems, and newly interconnected networks that no one fully understood yet. It was a perfect environment for the birth of a new type of crime. The first known clue arrived in 2009, when a regional bank in Eastern Europe reported something strange. Their ATM audit logs showed cash withdrawals at times when no customers were near the machines. Camera footage revealed nothing abnormal, no card inserted, no PIN entered, no physical interaction at all. The machine simply dispensed bills, as if obeying an invisible command. Internal teams suspected a glitch or insider involvement, not realizing they were witnessing the testing phase of a soon-to-be global cyber attack model. Meanwhile, in Moscow, cybersecurity researchers began detecting a spike in malware samples targeting ATM operating systems. These were not crude viruses. These were tailored scripts written by someone who clearly had deep knowledge of ATM vendor architecture. They weren't designed to steal card data, as most cybercriminals attempted at that time. They were coded to control the machine itself. That was the first sign that this threat was not about credit card fraud. It was about something far more direct and profitable, commanding the ATM to spit out cash on demand. By 2011, the whisper solidified. A small group of sophisticated hackers had formed an organized syndicate. Unlike typical cybercriminal gangs that focused on card skimming or phishing, this group targeted the core of the banking hardware. Their operation was built around three pillars: anonymity, precision, and silence. They understood that traditional robberies were messy and risky. If they could remotely access ATM systems, they could eliminate the human element entirely. No physical break-ins, no stolen cards, no compromised customers, no interaction with the machine. Money would simply emerge into the hands of an assigned cash collector, who appeared only when the machine was already prepared to pay out. Investigators later discovered that the syndicate structured itself like a professional tech company rather than a criminal gang. There were developers, testers, network intrusion experts, logistics coordinators, and even quality assurance roles. Each person specialized in one area and rarely knew the identities of others. Communication happened only through encrypted channels, and every operation was tested thoroughly before deployment. They treated ATM hacking as a scalable business model. By 2013, their methods had evolved far beyond simple malware infections. They began experimenting with direct network infiltration, using weak bank security protocols to enter the internal environment. They mapped bank networks quietly, sometimes spending months inside systems without detection. At the same time, they recruited money mules across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and later Western Europe. Individuals tasked with physically collecting the cash once the ATMs executed the silent withdrawals. The mules were instructed not to touch the ATM, not to insert a card, not to press any key. Their only job was to approach the machine at an exact minute, take the cash, and walk away. Financial institutions remained unaware of the scale of the threat. Losses were written off as accounting errors, system glitches, or inside job suspicions. Banks avoided reporting these incidents, fearing reputational damage. Their silence played directly into the syndicate's advantage, allowing the criminals to refine their techniques without being pursued. Everything changed when a major Eastern European bank finally detected the presence of the malware, later known in the cybersecurity world as Cyberattack. It was the syndicate's first large-scale tool to gain global attention. The code was sophisticated, modular, and adaptable to multiple ATM vendors. It required precise deployment, but once installed, it allowed criminals to control machines at will. This discovery confirmed what had previously only been rumor. Someone had successfully weaponized ATM hardware. What investigators did not yet realize was that Cyberattack was only the beginning, the first public-facing shadow of a much deeper and more silent operation. The syndicate's true innovation was not malware that required touching the machine, but the development of a technique that allowed for contactless ATM cash-outs. A robbery executed without physical interaction, without evidence left behind, and without the machine showing any signs of tampering. The criminal world was entering a new era, one where the classic image of a masked thief with a crowbar or a gun was being replaced by a person standing calmly beside an ATM, appearing to be nothing more than a passerby, while millions in cash were silently drained from banks that never even knew they were being robbed. They built their tools patiently, like engineers testing a new product line. The syndicate's developers learned to speak the language of ATM vendors, the protocols that trigger dispensers, the service ports used during maintenance, the remote management consoles bank technicians logged into. They reverse-engineered firmware, analyzed debug modes, and discovered the weak links where human convenience had become an exploit. One favored vector was the service interface, the ports used by technicians to run diagnostics or update software. Those ports were often protected by little more than simple credentials or accessible only from inside bank networks. If a criminal could reach that internal network, the service port became a backdoor. Once the syndicate accessed that channel, they could send direct dispense commands or disable event logging for brief windows of time. Another method exploited how banks managed remote administrative access. Many institutions used remote desktop or VPN solutions with single-factor authentication. A successful spear phishing campaign against an administrative user could yield valid credentials. From there, attackers moved laterally. They harvested passwords, found shared service accounts, and escalated privileges. With higher-level access, they could create temporary scheduled tasks to trigger cash-outs at specific times, masking the activity among legitimate system events. Not all attacks were purely digital. Jackpotting, the physical manipulation of an ATM to make it spit out cash, reappeared in a modern guise. Small teams would drill tiny holes behind maintenance panels, attach improvised controllers to the dispenser, and send commands that forced the mechanism to empty its trays. Black box attacks were an evolution of this idea, a compact device connected to the machine's internal port, controlled wirelessly from a nearby vehicle. A technician's bag, a routine-looking maintenance van, or a pair of workers in uniforms could be enough cover. But the syndicate's most elegant and dangerous technique combined both approaches. In some operations, they used malware to alter the machine's monitoring software so it registered normal status while secretly accepting external dispense commands. In others, they corrupted logs so withdrawals appeared as legitimate, low-value transactions, or as automated cash rebalancing. When auditors later reviewed records, the traces were faint, scattered, and easily explained away as human error or a benign system update. Timing was critical. The syndicate synchronized cash-outs across dozens of machines, sometimes in different neighborhoods, sometimes across cities. The coordination was impressive. Runners at each machine, ready at an exact minute, getaway drivers positioned, safe houses prepared to receive the proceeds. The operation looked almost like a military maneuver, with reconnaissance, supporting roles, and contingency plans if a machine failed or a mule was detained. Recruitment and operational security were equally sophisticated. Cash-out crews were often strangers to one another, contacted through intermediaries who advertised temporary work on criminal forums or used recruitment networks within marginalized communities. They were paid immediately and handsomely, but instructed to know as little as possible about the broader plan. Compartmentalization minimized the risk of leaks. If a mule was caught, law enforcement would reach a dead end because the person could only point to a middleman and the next anonymous contact. Behind the scenes, the syndicate invested in money laundering infrastructure. Proceeds were quickly funneled through shell companies, layered into legitimate-seeming transactions, or converted into cryptocurrencies, and passed through mixing services. The goal was to insert illicit cash into seemingly lawful streams before investigators could trace it back. The scale of these operations forced banks to rethink assumptions. Where previously fraud teams had focused on card-present fraud, they now faced attacks that manipulated machine behavior and operational systems. Incident responders struggled to detect stealthy intrusions that carefully limited noisy behaviors, staying under the radar by avoiding large, obvious changes. When investigators finally connected the dots, they found overlapping indicators across multiple incidents, similar malware signatures, common command and control infrastructure, and repeated use of the same laundering channels. Cybersecurity firms began to publish reports, and law enforcement took notice. But the syndicate adapted. When one tool was exposed, they retired it and shifted to a new method. Their agility was a product of their structure. Decentralized teams that could swap tactics like a tech startup pushed a software update. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was how often human error opened the door. A single reused password, a delayed software patch, or a misconfigured firewall could be enough. The syndicate exploited these small mistakes repeatedly. They understood that systems are built by people, and people make predictable errors. Their campaigns were less dramatic than a masked robbery, but in sophistication and profit they outshone almost every traditional theft. Local law enforcement found themselves chasing a ghost that moved rapidly across borders. An attack that began with a server in one country could lead to cash pickups in another and laundering channels routed through a third. Mutual legal assistance treaties, slower by design, could not always keep pace with the speed of the syndicate's operations. In the gaps between investigations, the criminals continued to operate, learning from each incident and hardening their own tradecraft. Yet pressure mounted. As cybersecurity firms published technical analyses and shared indicators of compromise, banks began to patch vulnerabilities and segment access more strictly. Governments formed special task forces to pursue mule networks and dismantle laundering hubs. High-profile arrests, when they occurred, were publicized to send a message. The international community was beginning to fight back. Still, for every exposed tool, there were others waiting in the wings. The syndicate's approach was not dependent on a single exploit. It was a methodology, a blueprint for converting access into cash with minimal traces. Until the industry fixed the weakest links, human processes, network segmentation, and physical ATM design, the threat would persist. For years, the syndicate operated with an almost clinical invisibility. Their success was measured in unreported losses, small for a single incident but enormous in aggregate, and in the absence of obvious suspects. That invisibility began to crack not because one agency suddenly became omnipotent, but because multiple disciplines started talking to each other. Cyber threat intelligence, financial crime units, bank fraud teams, and international law enforcement. The hunt shifted from chasing code to tracing the cash. Investigators discovered that the weakest link was not always the malware or the dispenser. Those were hard to analyze and easy to conceal, but the human web that collected, moved, and sanitized the proceeds. The cash-out crews left a trail of mundane vulnerabilities: phone numbers, travel records, rental cars, and hurried withdrawals at ATMs on CCTV. These small mistakes created patterns. A mule who took a single call from an organizer could later be linked to a dozen withdrawals. A chain of cash pickups across suburban ATMs hinted at a coordinated operation rather than a random series of withdrawals. Case files reveal how law enforcement pieced together crimes that span continents. In one multi-country probe, analysts matched timestamps from ATM logs with surveillance footage. They cross-referenced the footage with license plate records, bank card usage, and mobile phone pings. Layer by layer, the tapestry of the criminal network became visible. The locations of safe houses, the vehicles used to ferry cash, and the offshore accounts where money briefly rested. Technology companies contributed by publishing technical indicators, malware hashes, command patterns, and server IP addresses. Those clues allowed defenders to spot reused infrastructure. In several notable incidents, investigators tracked the command and control servers to data centers rented under false identities. Following payments to those hosting accounts led to payment processors and, eventually, to individuals whose identities could be legally challenged. One of the watershed moments came when analysts linked multiple incidents to a common set of tactics and tools. What had looked like separate, opportunistic attacks suddenly resembled a single, evolving campaign. The campaigns had names: Cyberattack, FIN7, Tyupkin in their public-facing monikers, but behind those labels were living, adaptive groups that borrowed ideas and rebuilt them into new iterations. When prosecutors in one country secured indictments, intelligence-sharing mechanisms allowed other nations to follow up with arrests and asset seizures. It was slow, painstaking work, but it worked. The prosecutions that followed were instructive. Arrests rarely captured the masterminds at the top of the hierarchy. Instead, they often targeted the middlemen, the mule organizers, the data hosting facilitators, the local hardware teams. Still, those arrests disrupted operational capacity. They exposed recruitment channels and money laundering techniques. They also offered courts a way to showcase the mechanics of touch-free robberies, turning what had seemed like abstract cybercrime into criminal cases grounded in physical evidence and human witnesses. Parallel to law enforcement activity, banks retooled. They hardened network access, separated ATM management systems from customer networks, and deployed behavior-based monitoring to flag abnormal dispense patterns. Incident response playbooks became more common and more practiced. Instead of treating an unusual cash dispense as an isolated glitch, banks now treated it as a potential indicator of compromise and began to escalate immediately. But the syndicate adapted as fast as defenders learned. When one laundering channel was shut down, they shifted to another. When a particular malware signature was published, they rewrote modules or swapped to a new family of tools. The churn of tools and tactics underscored a core truth. The problem was not a single vulnerability, but a systemic combination of human processes, fragile infrastructures, and cross-border coordination gaps. Forensic analysts learned to work differently. Beyond binary malware analysis, they developed a taxonomy of the attacks, patterns of choice in dispenser commands, timing patterns of cash-outs, and signature rhythms in log manipulation. Those rhythms became a language. When a new incident matched a known rhythm, investigators could infer much about the adversary's capabilities and likely behaviors. Financial investigators also learned to track the cash in creative ways. Instead of relying solely on bank transfer trails, they monitored prepaid cards, Hawala-style networks, and even localized cash collection businesses that fronted as distributors. The laundering techniques were often low-tech, shell companies issuing bogus invoices, cash deposited at multiple branches in small amounts, and quick conversion to goods that could cross borders. These techniques gave the syndicate plausible deniability and made asset recovery arduous. Yet the human stories that surfaced in court filings revealed the real cost. A bank manager who had been used as an unwitting access vector described the moment she realized her credentials had been abused. A mule testified about being recruited through a promise of easy money, later facing charges and prison time. For victims, small banks and local economies, the impact was tangible: lost reserves, damaged reputations, and the labor of rebuilding trust. The international response evolved into a new doctrine: treat cyber-enabled cash theft as a hybrid threat that requires integrated responses. Working groups formed, combining public and private sectors. Europol and other multinational organizations coordinated sting operations to catch cash-out crews in the act. In several instances, simultaneous raids were organized so that when mules began withdrawals, police were waiting at other nodes of the network. Those operations produced arrests and convictions that temporarily reduced activity and offered valuable intelligence about the syndicate's operational playbook. But perhaps the most sobering lesson was that dismantling a syndicate is not the same as eliminating the threat. The underlying incentives remained strong. Where ATMs remained an easy target and cash-outs were profitable, new groups would emerge. And in a landscape where resources to defend were unevenly distributed, the syndicate sought out banks with weak controls, smaller institutions, regional providers, or banks in countries with less matured cybersecurity postures. The next phase of the story delves into the human anatomy of a syndicate, a close look at the roles, the recruitment, and the dark marketplaces that fueled the operation. It examines how technical mastery married operational discipline, creating an enterprise that was both resilient and replicable. That is where the blueprint for future attacks was refined, and where defenders found both the greatest challenges and the best opportunities to strike back.